left Hawaii, and they sailed across the Pacific. Recently I went to Tahiti, I flew. And we were over the ocean for 4 hours, and I just reflected on the fact that, 700 years ago, my ancestors got in a hollowed out tree trunk and paddled across, what they sailed across it. That's something. Anyway, the Tainui Waka arrived at Kawhia. So Kawhia is on the west coast of the North Island. That's our spiritual land, our spiritual home. That's where Ngati Toa comes from. And when they arrived there, the Tainui people set up and occupied the land there, and would occupy it for a number of generations, really until about 1820 when we left. And we'll talk about that. Take a little bit of a break from that and just switch over to the Europeans, because they fit into our story as well. Some around 400 years later, 300 to 400 years later, the Europeans were starting to get a handle on these stars things. And a notable scientist called Edmund Halley went to an island called St. Helena. Now that's in the mid-Atlantic, just south of the equator, because the Europeans had not yet mapped the stars of the southern hemisphere. And he went there, and his job was exactly that, to map the stars of the southern hemisphere. He worked out, he saw something while he was there. He watched the sun, and he saw the planet Mercury go across the face. He came up with an idea, and it's a brilliant idea, it was a brilliant idea at the time, that he could use that to determine how far away the sun was. The problem was, there wouldn't be another planet that would go across the face of the sun for another 99 years. And that would be Venus. They knew that, and he knew he wouldn't be alive. But he developed the plans, and he put them together, and the Royal Society, which is the scientific society in London, at the right time, they got together they chartered a military ship, and they sent out an expedition that would go and do the measurement to work out how far away the sun was. So the 1765 observation didn't work so well, but in 1769, one of them turned up in Tahiti. The name of the ship is the Endeavour, and the captain is Cook. So he set up, and he was on a scientific expedition at that time. He set up and he observed the transit of Venus across the sun. They did it too. They had another party somewhere in the Netherlands, and they used something called parallax, and they worked out pretty much spot on how far away the sun was. So it was cool. More important to our story, though, is that he was a military man, it was a military ship, and when he had finished his scientific observations, he opened secret orders. And this is what they said. I don't expect you to read that, but there's just a couple of key points that we'll take out of here. He was instructed after the expedition to Tahiti to head south to search for the Great Southern Land. All the Northern Europeans believed that there was enormous land in the south. They were having trouble with the Americans, so they couldn't send their rebel to America anymore, because that's right, just as the American Revolution was starting. And so they were looking for another land that they could exploit the resources of. They believed that because there was so much land in the north, there must be the same amount of land in the south. And so those were his orders. Basically, he was to head south to a certain latitude. If that didn't find anything, then head west until he runs into New Zealand, which is what he did. Interesting, some of the points in his instructions. He says, you are likewise to observe the genius, temper, disposition, and number of the natives, if there be any, and endeavour by all proper means to cultivate a friendship and alliance with them, blah, blah, blah. You are also, with the consent of the natives, to take possession of convenient situations in the country. So these were the instructions that he got. This is around 200 years after the Europeans had settled America, and they've made a complete hash of that. And so it's good they had some semblance of conscience by about this time. So Cook arrives in New Zealand in 1769. He didn't find the great land mass, but he arrived on the east coast, and the life of Maori would change forever. You might think it was because of this, but it wasn't. Cook might have had muskets as well, but he didn't leave a lot, if he left any, and once the ammunition's gone, it's gone. What he did leave, though, which did impact Maori significantly, were pigs and potatoes. So he let these things run. And the reason this is significant is because at this time there was no significant meat sources for for Maori. The moa, the large flightless bird, had gone extinct about 1500. And so the only crop was the kumara, which was the sweet potato brought from Polynesia. It is a tropical plant though, and only grows in where you can see the yellow there. So by about 1700, this is a map of where Maori lived mostly, pretty much around the kumara. So Maori had a combination of hunter-gatherer lifestyle, but we're also farmers. Okay, and we farmed the kumara and the taro and some other further north as well. What's that got to do with it, right? Well, here's the crux where we jump back into the story of Ngati Toa. Around about the time, or a couple of decades after Cook arrived, we were living in the Waikato region. The Tainui people had spread throughout the Waikato, and there was a lot of warfare going on. It was essentially been described as a period of civil war. And the story goes that one of the chiefs of Ngati Toa, Piko Te Rangi, got upset about something that happened to him in the context of this ongoing warfare, and he gathered together an army. And this army, in some narratives, was about 10,000 strong, and he was determined to, with his army, attack his enemies of Waikato. So a battle occurred. It's called, we call it Hingakaka, and it occurred, if you know the Waikato region, just to the south of Hamilton, close to Te Awamutu. This is significant because there has only ever been one other army of a size of more than 10,000 or more, and that was when George Grey took his army into the Waikato to take the land. The reason that is relevant is that Piko Te Rangi and Ngati Toa were defeated at that battle, despite having superior numbers. This set the platform for basically further fighting and retribution. And the cycle continued for quite a while. Now in that context, in 1819, two Ngāpuhi chiefs, oh no, there wasn't two, but there was a group from Ngāpuhi who were on their way to Wellington. They had muskets and they were heading down south. They were going down the highway of the Maori people, which was the west coast, and they stopped in a kawhia. They stayed with Ngati Toa, and when they were ready to leave, a number of chiefs, including Te Rauparaha, Te Rangi Haiata, Te Pehi Kupe, decided that they would go with him. This isn't a trivial thing to if you live in the far north, to walk to Wellington. There wouldn't be horses. And the reason this slide is a little bit long-winded, but a lot of this history comes from a book written by our tupuna Tamihana Te Rauparaha, who was the son of Te Rauparaha, and he describes this event in some detail. Anyway, they walked from where we were, Kawhia, all the way to Wellington. And a number of things happened there, and Ngāpuhi, along with Ngati Toa and Ngati Tama and others, established mana in this particular area. There's one story there that they were standing on the shores of the Cook Strait, and they were looking out over the Cook Strait, and they saw two sailing ships going through. One of the Ngāpuhi chiefs turned to Te Rauparaha and said, "You should come and live here. This is a good place to be. You should come and live by the Europeans. You'll be able to trade with them, and life will be good." And Te Rauparaha, it turns out, took that on board, given the heat of the exchanges that were happening in the Waikato. He took that on board and gave it some thought. We can say that the seed was planted there. Anyway, they returned to the Waikato. Oh, sorry, before they returned to the Waikato, this slide is about, so the ships that went through the Cook Strait, they were the ships of the Bellingshausen expedition. And so we know the exact date that this happened. It was the Bellingshausen expedition was two ships, the Russian ships that were chartered to circumnavigate the Antarctic. And so they recorded the event. They stopped, they didn't come over to the North Island, but they went to the South Island, and they have records of the interactions with Rangitania there. So after that, they walked back again. There are some stories about what happened next. For Ngati Toa, there's a push factor. Things are getting pretty hot. There's ongoing warfare in the Waikato. If you look at the oral histories, Ngati Toa did a really good job, but we've always been a small iwi. Did a really good job. The other factor was, though, that we're in the period where European technology was just arriving, and so the pull of the Cook Strait and seeing those ships was another factor as well. Shortly after the expedition got back, it said that warfare broke out. Basically, all of Waikato had decided they had enough of Ngati Toa, and a large group congregated in Kawhia, and a battle occurred. This battle is called Te Kakara, and this is a famous battle in our history. So Te Kakara is a place beside a lake called Taharoa. During that battle, Ngati Toa and our allies were defeated, and the first stage after that particular battle was Ngati Toa, Ngati Tama, Ngati Kota, Ngati Utunga were dispersed, and Te Rauparaha and a group went to this place called Te Arawi. It's a rocky outcrop just on the southern shores of the Kawhia harbour. Effectively, the decision was made at that point that it was time to leave. So this, you could argue, was the next great migration of Ngati Toa. The first one was migrating from Hawaii. The second one is what we call Heke Tahu Tahuahi. There's a reason for that particular name, which I won't go into now because it's a bit long. But basically, they were migrating towards the south because Ngati Toa had allies in Taranaki. They stopped at a place called the Moko River, which was the boundary between the Waikato and our enemies, and Taranaki, which were our allies. They would then go on to further south and stay with a number of Taranaki family there. So we'd stay in a number of places. So in the context of this is in following a period of war. Ngati Toa had been defeated. There were probably a lot of our people that were injured and hurt, and it was a very difficult time. We stayed in northern Taranaki, and the second part of our migration was Heke Tātaramoa. Tātaramoa is a name for a bramble bush. If you're walking through a track and there's a lot of these bushes, it's a very difficult journey. So that refers to how difficult the journey was. And as you can see, it's a very long way as well. There were a number of incidents that happened along the way, but one that's important to note is that Ngati Toa at this particular time was attempting to migrate, I don't know if peacefully is the right word, but had no intention of bringing warfare with them, simply for a number of valid reasons. They were given some land at a place called Waikawa, which is in the Horowhenua Kapiti region, and while they were there, Ngati Toa set up a pā there. Te Rauparaha was invited to go and visit the chief of Muaukoko. Muaukoko were the locals that were there. And he was invited to go there and trade. He traded greenstones for wakas. And he said, yep, okay, and he took his children. While he was there, they had a feast of eels, but that evening, a group of Muaukoko attacked him and his party, and all, depending upon the story you listen to, all but one of his children was killed. Te Rauparaha himself got away with his life, but that changed the whole flavour of Ngati Toa's migration, and it was essentially from that point all the gloves were off. Okay, so for the next year or two, Ngati Toa was residing along the Kapiti coast. In 1822, our chief Te Pehi Kupe took Kapiti Island from the previous inhabitants and became the home of Ngati Toa at that stage. 1824, a ship called the Urania appeared. It was off the coast of Kapiti and it was becalmed, so they couldn't go anywhere. And Te Pehi and a few others paddled out there, and he was determined to get to go to England to see the king. He climbed on board, and they told him to get off, but he wouldn't. They tried to throw him off, but he wouldn't. And sooner or later, the captain said, "Fine, you're coming with us." So he went to London, and he was a bit of a hit there. There were a lot of news reports about Te Pehi being in London at the time. He was going there for muskets. There was a significant, obviously there was an arms race. The muskets were being distributed unevenly throughout the country, and if you didn't have them, you were going to die. So he went there to get muskets. They might have learned from Hongi Hika 4 years earlier that giving muskets to the natives wasn't a good idea, so he received farm implements and shovels. And the story is he came back via Sydney and sold the implements for muskets. 1820s was an interesting time. The sailing ships, the whalers and the sealers had started to arrive. It was a really good time to find yourself on Kapiti. The reason is that the Cook Strait had a lot more seals and whales than it does now, and the ships would come and they would, Kapiti would be a natural place to dock. And of course, if you dock there, you trade, or seek permission of and trade with the iwi that was there. That was Te Rauparaha and Ngati Toa. The effect of that was that Ngati Toa was able to build up a significant amount of economic trade, and they were able to trade with the Europeans that were coming. The trade consisted of flax, potatoes, pigs, and other things. But the scale of it was quite unprecedented. So much so, and obviously one of the drivers was to acquire muskets. One of the drivers was to basically acquire muskets. So much so that it said that Ngati Toa at that stage had more muskets than any other iwi outside of the farm wall. And so with muskets came conquest. And from 1827 to 1832, Ngati Toa pushed even further and further south. So this included campaigns over to Whakatū, Nelson, Wairo's Blenheim. 1828, I think Ngati Toa headed to Wairo, then a little while later went to Kaikoura, and then headed further south to Kaiapohia. And the point of that was to trade for greenstone. An event happened there that was a problem for us. Te Pehi Kupe, our ariki, our chief, went into trade with Ngāi Tahu. While he was in there, he was killed along with Ngāi Tamata and a few others. Ngati Toa left at that stage, but that could not be left unheard. This is another important incident that has happened in our history as well. The Elizabeth is a ship that came to Kapiti in 1830. Te Rauparaha managed to negotiate passage for a group of warriors to be hidden in the hull and taken south to seek revenge for the death of Te Pehi Kupe in Christchurch. So aboard the Elizabeth, Ngati Toa sailed south, and on the ship, the chief of Ngāi Tahu at the time was Tāmai Haranui, and he was enticed to come on board by the English captain. And at that point, Ngati Toa took him prisoner and took him back to Kapiti. And so he was there. 1832, Ngati Toa had feeling that the debt had not been repaid, returned again. This time to Kaiapohia, Pa. And Ngati Toa, Te Atiawa, Ngati Raukawa attacked this Pa. So this particular drawing is a drawing by Tamihana Te Rauparaha describing how that Pa was attacked. The zigzag lines are the trenches they built to attack the Pa. The Pa is the part on the left. Why do you think they don't trick out zigzags? No idea? By that time, the defenders had muskets. And so if you wanted to get to the pub, you'd like zigzags, there's no straight line for musket fire. Okay. Moving on a little bit more. I won't talk too much about this, but there were some more conflicts which happened in the Kapiti region between Ngati Toa and our allies, Te Atiawa and Ngati Raukawa. It was a difficult time in that Ngati Toa found itself split over a particular conflict that lasted for quite a while. The 1830s were, again, an interesting time as more and more Europeans were coming to New Zealand. It was Maori people wanted to get a European. What they would do is they would marry Europeans to their daughters. Now the reasons for this, there were a number of reasons. One, a significant one obviously is if you want to form a relationship with other groups, marriage is a good way to do that, but also having a European in your camp means you have better access to language, better trade, he was more likely to be trusted if they didn't like the natives, etc. So these are just some of the Europeans that married some of Ngati Toa. This last one, 1832. He's aware that Ngati Toa has great amounts of land in Wairau, in the Blenheim area. He writes, he approaches Te Rauparaha and others, and he says, I'd like to use that land, I'd like to use it to take water and feed cattle, etc. Ngati Toa agrees, but he wrote up this, what's it called, indenture, the Blenkinswap indenture. He writes this up, and effectively that says that Ngati Toa is relinquishing all of about 600,000 acres in Blenkinswap. Ngati Toa didn't know that at the time, and it said that when Te Rauparaha found out, he tore it up and was adamant that those lands had never been sold. This was the price, by the way. This is a cabin sitting outside the regional council office in Blenheim. Blenkinswap offered that to Ngati Toa, but they sabotaged it before they gave it. That's important. We're going to come back to that. That has a bearing on where we're going. We're going to switch over now to the British again and to talk about the 1830s. You can describe the 1830s in British politics as a period of liberal progressivism. Liberal progressivism. Slavery was abolished. There was significant pressure from people like the Church Missionary Society and the Aboriginal Protection Society to do right by the Aboriginals that they were trying to colonize, the lands they were trying to colonize. So they came up with this idea called preemption. Preemption says the natives get to keep their land and they don't have to sell it, but if they do, they can only sell it to the Crown. So they came up with the idea that they would go to New Zealand and establish a treaty which would determine that particular principle. The trouble there was that there was another commercial operation in Britain called the New Zealand Company. They weren't the Crown and they wanted to buy up large amounts of land. So they arrived here in 1839 and their goal was to go around Wellington, Kapiti, as many places as they can, and give away trinkets so they could acquire large amounts of land. So they did that. There's a number of purchases that were made here. They arrived on Kapiti Island. And they established what we call the Kapiti deed, and the grey area is what they believed that they were buying. And it just wasn't true. That isn't what was sold, but that's what they claimed. Interestingly, that on that trip, the New Zealand Company went even further north, and they bought that document, the Blenkinswap indenture, which is titled, which it says in English, it's titled to 600,000 acres in the Wairau. So that was a problem because the treaty had been established and it said Maori people get to keep the things that are important to them and don't have to sell it, but if they do, they have to sell it to the Crown. So in 1840, the treaty was established, and so there was a natural conflict between the Crown and the New Zealand Company, who was a private organisation. So the Crown established a commission to determine what sales were valid. In 1842, however, the New Zealand Company had a bunch of immigrants coming along, and they had that document, the Blenkinswap Agreement. So they went into Blenheim, the Blenheim area. They decided, because of this deed we purchased, this is our land. They sent surveyors in, and they started to divide up the land basically for the settlers. Ngati Toa hears about this and arrives there around June 1843, kicks the settlers out. Sorry, not the settlers, the surveyors. This is a problem, and the constabulary in Nelson decides that we're going to send a posse and going to go and arrest Ngati Toa. And so they send a group to where Ngati Toa is at the time. Things don't go so well, and a firefight breaks out. The militia, the Pākehā Europeans, surrender and try to run. They get captured. The problem is that during the firefight, Tarangi Haeta's wife gets killed, and he extracts vengeance. So he basically lines up 22 of the Europeans and kills them. This is called the Wairau, what's it called today? Incident. It's been called the Wairau Affray, the Wairau Massacre in the past. This is the first time that Europeans and Maori had come to war over land since the treaty was signed. So skipping ahead to 3 years. We get to 1846. The European settlers are arriving. George Grey has arrived, and he's got a job of getting New Zealand Company all the land that they think they own. Tarangi Haeta says, look, you guys can have the southern Hutt Valley, but we'll keep the northern Hutt Valley for ourselves. The Europeans establish a fortification at a place called Bolcott's Farm. And in May, it's attacked by Ngati Toa, who are relatives of the people who are living in the north. George Grey blames Tarangi Haeta and Ngati Toa. He declares a state of emergency, military law, and he sails to Plymouth and he arrests Te Rauparaha. He takes him aboard a ship where he'll be held for around about 18 months. Once he's taken care of Te Rauparaha, he orders his army to sail over to Pāwatahanui and attack the pā of Tarangi Haeta, Ngati Toa. Tarangi Haeta is overwhelmed and retreats to the north. Where a last stand is made on a place we call today Battle Hill. Effective, so although the battle wasn't decisive, Tarangi Haeta is forced out. With this circumstance, in the context of 1846, Ngati Toa's resistance is diminished now. And with the capture of Te Rauparaha and Tarangi Haeta being driven out, Ngati Toa succumbs to the pressure by the government. And effectively is coerced into selling around 3 million acres in the Wairau Valley, and the Purirugi, which is around 70,000 acres. So this is the context of where Ngati Toa finds itself today. This is our history, this is where we've come from, this is what has happened to us. Now since that time, there have been more things that have happened in our environment, but in 1984, a number of our kaumātua had agreed to put together the Treaty of Waitangi claim. So the Treaty of Waitangi claim is our claim against the government for breaches of that document, the Treaty of Waitangi. And it's to compensate for all of the types of things such as this, where the land has been confiscated from us and effectively our resources were taken. So that was a long time. That was, 140 years, and it wasn't settled for another 30 years after that. So in 2012, Ngati Toa achieved settlement of that particular claim, and at that particular day, around about the value of about $70 million transferred from the hands of the Crown into Ngati Toa. To manage those assets, Ngati Toa established a runanga, and that's who we are here today. So we've come here to tell you today about how we are managing those assets on your behalf, what we've been doing, and together get your feedback. I'm going to leave it there and hand it over to Taki to finish up.
That's a lot of work. Give them a round of applause.